Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us here at the Council of the Americas today for what promises to be a very important and timely program regarding civilian security in Central America. My name is Eric Farnsworth and I head the Washington office of the Council, and it's a real privilege to welcome such a distinguished and knowledgeable audience, all of you, here to the program today. We have ambassadors, we have senior diplomatic officials, we have government representatives, members of the policy community, the private sector. Each one of you is an important voice in these issues, and we thank you for joining us today. And I also want to give a very special welcome to those of us who are joining us via the internet on our webcast program. So welcome from remote location to cold and wintry Washington, even though it's technically spring here. That all of you are here on a Friday afternoon before Semana Santa and spring break is a real signal of the importance, we believe, of the issues that we're discussing today, both to the people of Central America and to the hemisphere more broadly. Many of you know my personal background, which includes several years at the State Department working on Central American issues in the early 1990s, where I met a number of you, including our speaker this afternoon. As well, the Council as an institution has taken a special interest in Central America over the years, in part because several of our previous leaders, including our current chairman, have spent time during their careers as ambassadors or otherwise have significant experience in the Central American region. And it's for these reasons, as well as our desire to promote strong, open market democracies with effective administration of justice and rule of law, working in partnership with the United States and other like-minded nations to promote a peaceful, more prosperous region, that we're focusing on Central America today and working more broadly to bring attention to this important region and offer ideas for the international community to consider in support of regional transformation. By general consensus, ladies and gentlemen, it seems that the security situation in Central America is deteriorating. And according to the U.S. Department of State, this deteriorating security situation directly threatens citizen safety. A potent cocktail of narcotics trafficking, organized criminal activities, and weak institutions is undermining regional progress, discouraging legitimate economic growth, legitimate economic activity, and stunting growth. But there is good news, and that good news is that this reality is widely acknowledged, and the governments of the Central American region have determined, therefore, to work together to address the underlying issues. This cannot be too overly emphasized or encouraged. Even today, as most or all of you know, right here in Washington at the Organization of American States, several countries from the hemisphere are leading an effort to undermine the Inter-American Human Rights Framework. The overall hemispheric consensus that many of us in this room have worked so hard to achieve over the years seems to have broken down somewhat. And yet, the Central American region, through the Central America Regional Security Initiative, or CARSI, is working together. It's a collaborative approach that is supported financially by the United States and includes the 7 nations of Central America, and other Latin American nations are also participating. No doubt, the program has a long way to go. No doubt, progress is not always in a straight line, and we're going to hear about that today. No doubt, the issues are horribly complicated and challenge even the most capable officials, who lack in some ways sufficient resources and even hours in the day to do all the things that need to be done. But it's not for a lack of interest, and it's not for a lack of effort. But in my view, this is exactly the kind of cooperation that will be increasingly relevant in hemispheric affairs looking forward. Shifting groups of certain nations who may or may not see eye to eye on every topic, nonetheless coming together to address specific issues of direct interest for mutual gain. We see this happening in Central America. And now, collectively, we're obligated, in my view, to work purposefully and resolutely to see that this approach succeeds, addressing the issues in a manner that improves everyone's lives. And the person foremost charged with doing that, from the U.S. government perspective, is our speaker this afternoon, Ambassador William Brownfield, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. Bill is one of the most capable officials we have working on these issues. He's a career professional who has served as ambassador to no less than 3 Latin American nations. His assignments have included Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, El Salvador, and Panama, in addition to Geneva and Washington. And for good measure, for those of you who know him, you know that his wife, Christy Kinney, is the current ambassador to Thailand, but she's also served as ambassador to Ecuador. So that has to be some sort of record, at least in the Western Hemisphere environment, and we congratulate you, Bill, and your family for your successes. We're particularly pleased to be hosting Bill this afternoon because, indeed, he's just returned from a trip to Central America earlier this week, where he met with senior officials in civil society to discuss CARSI implementation and police professionalization and modernization, among other topics. Those of you who were here with us last time we hosted him in August 2011 will recall that he made a compelling case for assistance to the region, while noting at the same time that this will be a long and involved process and that the political and financial sustainability and true cooperation among all parties working together on a regional basis would be the key, and in my view, he's proven to be correct. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to welcome him back to the Council of the Americas for what promises to be a stimulating, thought-provoking, and dare I say it, even entertaining conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary of State, William R. Brownfield.
Why, thank you, Dr. Farnsworth. Let me adjust the microphone for a human of more normal size as opposed to a freakishly tall Homo sapien. Distinguished ambassadors, current and former, representatives of and members of the Council of the Americas, ladies and gentlemen. Eric was very gracious. He did not say, by the way, that I have also just returned from what I believe is my 6th, if not my 7th visit to Central America over the past 2 years, and I'm chagrined to report that I have returned with a deadly disease deeply embedded in my system. I mention this to you, ladies and gentlemen, not to tweak your sense of sympathy and pathos for me, but rather so that in the event that I suddenly collapse before you, Eric, could I ask you and perhaps Miles to come up and prop me up against the podium and more or less keep me vertical so that my headstone might read, "He died on his feet speaking truth, justice, and security." Ladies and gentlemen, as Eric mentioned, we are well into the drama that we are calling the Central America Regional Security Initiative, or CARSI. We're at, in essence, year 5 since we named it, and 4 full years of supporting it with resources and programs, people, and personnel. It's a serious initiative which has been going on for nearly 1/2 decade, and not at all surprisingly, it has generated comments and commentary throughout its existence, and most particularly in the course of the past year. The comments have come from a broad spectrum that involves the United States Congress, the media, foreign governments, civil society and NGOs, the academic community, the so-called think tanks. Some of the commentary is good. Some of the commentary could be described more in the nature of criticism. Regardless, at 4 years and counting, it's probably a good moment to pause, review where we are, and take stock of this initiative and this effort to address regional security in Central America. May I start with a very, I promise, very brief history in terms of how we got where we are right now. Ladies and gentlemen, once upon a time, there were 2 countries that bordered Central America. In the year 2000, one of those countries, let us call it Colombia, had reached a point where it developed its own plan to address its problems in its own country. And it called that plan Plan Colombia. and the international community, with the United States government very much a part thereof, supported it. It produced a great deal of success, and most observers would suggest that the Colombia of 2013 is a far better place than the Colombia of 1999. However, one impact of that success was to push many of its problems from Colombia, initially, to the far side of Central America, another country known to many of us as Mexico. And beginning in the year 2007, the Mexican government developed its approach, which they called the Mérida Initiative, to address Mexican problems in Mexico, but closely working with its neighbor to the north, the United States of America. And while I by no means mean to suggest to you that that program has been brought to successful conclusion, I do suggest that it is now having an impact. Much of the impact is positive. One bit of impact, however, is that just as Plan Colombia helped push the focus of criminal activity and presence north to Mexico, so has the impact of the Mérida Initiative pushed the same activities into Central America itself. In many ways, Central America is the victim of its own geography, as well as vulnerable institutions and societies that are found attractive to organizations that are attempting to engage in criminal activity. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we calculate that 65% of all cocaine that leaves South America en route to markets to the north passes through Central America. We calculate that there are more than 70,000 members of the two principal organized gangs in Central America, MS-13 and Calle 18. Some countries in Central America have a homicide rate in excess of 86 per 100,000. And to put that in some perspective for you, the United States of America, a nation that many regard as not the least violent in the world, has a homicide rate somewhere around 5, or less than 1/17 that of at least one country in Central America. So Carson was our response in the year 2008 to that set of circumstances. Our focus was twofold. We said we will focus on violence and we will focus on drugs. They are connected, but they are different. Not all violent criminals traffic in drugs. Not all drug traffickers commit violent crimes, but obviously there is a substantial amount of overlap between the two, and the one feeds the other. At the end of the day, we concluded that a program that only addresses drugs does not really meet the needs and requirements of 45 million common citizens of Central America whose real concern is violence and criminality on the streets in their communities and outside the doors to their homes. And we also concluded that if we were going to maintain consensus for an ambitious program in Central America by the United States Congress and political leadership, we would have to connect it to something directly of interest to the American people, and that brought us into drugs. 4 years later, we have spent $496 million, nearly $1.5 billion in Carson. The majority of that money has gone into the northern 3 countries of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, for reasons of the nature of the threat and the pressure that they are under today. but we have consciously attempted to incorporate all 7 nations of Central America into this CARSI effort. The objective was to coordinate all elements of the United States government and foreign assistance establishment in a comprehensive and coherent program. Institutions and capacity building, economic and social development, and operations and operational capacity. The objective was to take what previously had been 7 individual bilateral programs with each of the 7 governments of Central America and address the threats as a regional package instead of as individual country programs. And finally, the objective was to ask Central American leadership to be in the lead, to take ownership of the initiative, to provide the action plan under which we would provide assistance and support, and to guide us, modify, and adjust us as the years went by. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the concept. 4 years later, I can say to you that we have heard, are hearing, and I confidently predict, will continue to hear voices of criticism suggesting how it could be done better, or, in some cases, merely noting failure. Let me offer 5 of the strongest criticisms and offer my own observations on each of them. First, CARSI is nothing more than the militarization of our unsuccessful and failed war on drugs. Ladies and gentlemen, may I start by stating that we are not fighting a war on drugs, nor have we been fighting a war on drugs since Bill Clinton, in his first year of presidency in 1993, declared correctly, "This is not a war. This is about education and rehabilitation. This is about public health. This is about economic and alternative development, as well as building police capacity, prosecutor capacity, and some law enforcement. It is not a war," said the 42nd president, and ever since that time, we have been in fundamental agreement. In the case of CARSI, the point is even more clear in that less than 1/3 of the $496 million that has been made available under CARSI, in fact, goes to drug programs at all. That would be $160 million of the $496 million. The remainder goes to things such as the model precincts programs in vulnerable communities. It goes to anti-gang youth programs. It goes to community policing and community development programs that are tied together in ideally a coherent way. And it goes to police, prosecutor, and corrections reform throughout the Central American region. It is designed to build institutions, and it is those institutions that will eventually deliver what the societies and communities and peoples of Central America are demanding in terms of security and safety. To call it a war on drugs completely misses the point. Criticism number 2. Brownfield, you've been at this for more than 4 years. All the problems persist. You have failed, and CARSI is a failure. Ladies and gentlemen, While I am not a fundamentally smart man, and my wife can certainly attest to that, and will 4 or 5 times a day, although blissfully she's sleeping right now, I have in fact learned 1 or 2 lessons over the last 50 years or so. One of the most important, I submit, is this. When you are dealing with a problem set that has required generations to develop, the solution will take more than just a couple of days to produce itself. It will take years. I would suggest to you, for example, that if you had asked me in the year 2006, 6 years after we had begun an intense, systematic, and coordinated effort to work with the government of Colombia under the so-called Plan Colombia, if you had asked me in 2006, has this plan succeeded? I would have said then, no. It has not. We do not see the statistics. We do not see the evidence on the ground. By the next year it had. Lesson, I don't think it's a difference between 2006 and 2007. It is the fact that it takes a long time for systematic security reforms and enhancement of institutions to have an impact. I would suggest to you that if the only measure of success is whether the problem continues that you are attempting to address, ladies and gentlemen, we in the United States of America have attempted to stop homicides, to end discrimination, and to end poverty for more than 200 years. Have we failed? Are we to give up? Is that what it means? My own personal view is we are going at these problems gradually and systematically. At the end of the day, we will measure our success in CARSI through a variety of factors. Homicide rates, undoubtedly, but also rates of prosecution, poverty rate, and education rates, air and maritime tracks, because there is a drug element to this, gang activity, gang truces in places like El Salvador, the totality of these factors and the statistical story that they tell will eventually tell us if CARSI is or is not a success. But ladies and gentlemen, they will not tell us that in days, weeks, or months. They will tell us that in the process of years. Criticism number 3. CARSI cannot succeed because the institutions of government are so corrupt that they cannot actually perform what we are asking them to perform under CARSI. Ladies and gentlemen, I freely acknowledge right up front, corruption and impunity are part of the problem set that CARSI is supposed to address. And not just a small part of it, they are a fundamental part of that problem set. In a sense, that is what CARSI was collectively developed to address. How to make institutions less corrupt, more responsive, more accountable to the peoples, the nations, the governments with which they are affiliated and to whom they report. Of course, we must deal in the short term with corrupt institutions. If we are going to reform or professionalize an institution, we must talk to it, deal with it, work with it, and in fact provide assistance, training, and support to it. At the end of the day, with many institutions, it will require an entire generation to cleanse. The word in Spanish is depurar, and I'm not exactly sure what the best English translation would be. purge an institution that is that thoroughly corrupted. And, may I suggest, it is unfair to ask a community or a society to wait an entire generation before they can see any hope for relief from violence, criminality, organized crime on their streets and in their communities. Our solution to that problem, what do we do during the next 10 years or so that it would take in the best scenario possible to purify, cleanse, and purge a corrupted institution? Our short-term solution is the vetted unit. Small, select groups that are carefully selected, carefully examined in terms of their background, if necessary, subjected to technical testing means to determine whether they are fundamentally honest, and to use those groups to do basic, specialized law enforcement while waiting for the larger institution to improve. Criticism number 4. Systematic human rights abuses by government institutions in the region mean that CARCI will fail. Ladies and gentlemen, that criticism is absolutely true. If we do not address systematic human rights abuses, CARCI will indeed fail. No initiative that I know of for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years or so has succeeded unless it has followed a basic human rights, respect for human rights pattern that allows the people and the communities to support the initiative, to agree with what it is trying to accomplish, and to support those people, organizations, and institutions that are delivering those services. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why human rights must be a central and integral part of every element of the Central America Regional Security Initiative. Vetting the people who will be trained or educated, training them specifically in human rights procedures and proper operational engagement, and full accountability for acts that they commit and behavior by those institutions. These are fundamental elements of CARCI. And ladies and gentlemen, let me say it again. CARCI will not succeed if the human rights element of CARCI does not succeed. Final criticism, and number 5, is the balloon. The balloon effect. We're going to fail because even if we accomplish something in Central America, all we're doing is squeezing the balloon, and the problem will squirt out and go somewhere else. To that I say, ladies and gentlemen, maybe, but I would offer 3 sets of statistics. In the year 2000, the Republic of Colombia produced more cocaine than all the rest of the world combined. Now, its cocaine production has dropped by 2/3, and it has in fact dropped to position number 3 among cocaine producers in this world. In the year 2006, U.S. consumption of cocaine, that is to say consumption in the United States of America, was 40% higher than it is today. That's a clever way of saying cocaine consumption has dropped 40% in the U.S. in the past 7 years, and methamphetamine consumption has dropped 50%. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I do not mean to suggest that this means the drug problem for the world is over and done with. I presume there are enough smart people in this world to realize that other countries have increased cocaine consumption, production over the last 8 or 10 years, and that other drugs in the United States have in fact increased in popularity in the United States. But I do mean to suggest to you that if we're going to use the balloon analogy, we have to acknowledge the balloon seems to have gotten a little bit smaller. And I might add, if I were a citizen of one of the 7 countries of Central America, and I am not, but if I were one, I might say, why do we have to be the balloon? Where is it written that says it is the responsibility of Central America to absorb all of the crime, all of the violence, all of the homicides that come with vast quantities of narcotic product being transited through our territory? If you can show me where the people of Central America made that commitment, made that agreement, I suppose I would say to you, I find the balloon argument a little bit more compelling. I have not, in my many, many trips to the region, ever heard a single citizen of any of the 7 republics of Central America say, we are prepared to absorb this burden forever so that others will not have to suffer from this. I haven't heard it. If you have, I will pause shortly, and you will have every right in the world to draw my attention to that. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with a couple of lessons, and I would suggest to you that we have had the opportunity to learn lessons over the last 13 and a half years, because in the Western Hemisphere we have been working 4 different initiatives, starting with Plan Colombia in the year 2000, following with the Merida Initiative in the year 2007, the CARSI Initiative for Central America in 2008, and at roughly the same time, albeit at a much more preliminary stage, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, or CBSI, at the same time. Ideally, all 4 initiatives, while separate and distinct, link together in a coherent fashion. And over these last 13 years, we have learned some lessons. Lesson number 1, strategies take time to develop. Not days, weeks, and months, but years. Lesson number 2, strategies must be flexible and adaptable. We should not be embarrassed or ashamed to say that what we are doing today is actually very different from what we thought we were going to be doing 4 years ago. We are learning as the process develops. We are reacting to and responding to changes. We're learning from mistakes, and quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, the bad guys, the criminal organizations, they're adapting and adjusting their strategies. If we don't adjust ours, we're probably going to lose. Lesson number 3, our strategy must be comprehensive. Years ago in the 1970s, back when even Mr. Farnsworth was only about 40 or 50 years old, we had the brilliant idea that if we would just eradicate all of that pesky, illicit drug in the field, the drug problem would go away. It didn't. A few years later, we refined it and we said, well, eradication doesn't seem to do it. Let's just interdict it like crazy, and once we have severed the transit route, the problem will wither on the vine and go away. It didn't once again. Lesson learned, your strategy, your initiative, your policy must incorporate all elements of the problem. Education and treatment and rehabilitation, alternative and economic and social development. There has to be some degree of law enforcement, but there also has to be institution building, whether it's investigators or community police or prosecutors or courts. The correction system has to be incorporated into this. It's more than just the campesino and the guys who are working in the labs. It's also your money launderers, the financial system that is built up. All elements of the problem must be addressed. If you leave a gaping hole anywhere, that will be the means by which your initiative or your strategy will prove to be a failure. Lesson number 4, while there must be a law enforcement component to any security strategy, the focus of law enforcement should be on the genuine criminals, the large-scale, multi-billion-dollar criminal organizations that are making huge sums of money from this process, rather than poor farmers or poor consumers who are victims as much as criminals. And lesson number 5, institution building produces and pays far better long-term dividends than does operations. I do not disagree with operations. I get as happy as anyone else when I hear of a takedown of 30 or 40 tons of pure cocaine in some sort of maritime or air operation. But at the end of the day, that gets you a result that'll last for a headline and a week. Institution building will last for a generation. Ladies and gentlemen, Carsey is a baseball game. I submit we're in the 5th inning. The score is tied 3-3, and I might add the good guys have come back from being down 3-0 in the 1st inning. But we've got half of the game still to play. Starter is still in there, but he's tiring. We've got a pretty solid bullpen, and we've got the best closer in the league. All of which is to say, I'm fairly optimistic as to how this game, this strategy, this initiative is going to play out. I am optimistic first because as a native son of the state of Texas, I have a great deal to be optimistic about. I am optimistic second because of the economic and social logic of this situation. If the objective number 1 is to attack the drug transit problem in Central America, I say to myself, the logic is we do not need to create law enforcement paradise in Central America. What we need to do is improve capabilities by 10 or 15%. That will drive up the cost for the trafficking organizations of doing business in and through Central America. And when that happens, simple market economics comes into play. And they say, let us find a more economical place where we can do business, and they will go elsewhere. If the objective is, as it is, to reduce violence and basic criminality on the streets of Central America, then my logic, my social logic, goes as follows. You actually don't need to make your law enforcement institutions perfect. You need to allow the communities and societies to see improvement, to see that the police are getting better. Prosecutors are actually prosecuting more cases. Courts are actually rendering judgments with a degree of fairness and predictability to them. When you get the trend line moving in the right direction, history teaches us that societies will then begin to support their institutions. They don't support the institutions if they don't think the institutions are working, What we have to do is not create perfect institutions, but improving institutions. When that Rubicon is crossed, when you reach that tipping point, eventually then the society and the community will carry you the rest of the way. Because, ladies and gentlemen, and I conclude with this fine old chestnut, never, to the best of my knowledge, in the history of the human race, since Ugg and Thug joined Ugga and Thugga in their cave somewhere 45,000 years ago and established a community. Never since then has a criminal organization been able to succeed against a community and a society determined not to let them succeed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I believe in another number of years I will be invited back here by Mr. Farnsworth to talk to you about the success of Carson and how we did it. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and the dialogue. Shall I sit?
Please.
I'd be honored.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Bill, and for all of you, it was exactly as promised and previewed, and what a terrific way to start the conversation. I know that you're not feeling your usual 100%, so we're not going to keep you here for 10 hours of answering additional questions.
You may, but I reserve the right to sleep for the last 9.
So let me ask one question and then open it up to all of you, so you can get your thoughts going together. And we'll probably take a round of a couple and then ask the Assistant Secretary to respond. But Bill, you picked up today where you left off when you last addressed us, so thank you both for that continuity, but also for the update.
Kind of a seamlessness.
It was seamless, and
it's like you all went to sleep for a year and a half, and boop, woke up, and there I was, still talking again.
But some things changed in the context, not necessarily of Central America, but in the context of the United States. And much of what you talked about on the successful side was U.S. support for Central America, and you mentioned some budget figures. Subsequent to the last time you were here, the U.S. budget has become even more complicated. And for those government officials in the room, you may be spending 20% of your time with not much to do in the few weeks. And I guess the question would be, to the extent that this continues, and I know you're not a budget warrior with OMB or have a vote in Congress. I accept that and understand it. But how would this, or how is it already beginning to impact what you're doing in Central America and your broader strategy here? Give us a sense of what you're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start, Eric, by acknowledging the rather obvious point. This is not the greatest time in the history of the United States government to be responsible for managing and implementing large programs. And in fact, very rarely, perhaps since I'll use 1789 as the starting point, has there perhaps been a worse time in that regard? Maybe the Great Depression, but you might have to go back that far to get to that point. That said, we are allowed, under the rules of sequestration, to use our minds and our brains. Sequestration is a mathematical formula that we are required to apply, but nowhere in the legislation does it say we have to be stupid in applying it. We are allowed to assess priorities. We are permitted to determine with the pot of money that remains available to us, how do we get the best possible value for the programs, for the countries and governments with whom we are cooperating, and for the American people who have an understandable interest in understanding, knowing how money that has been appropriated from their taxes is being spent. May I tell you that Carson fits rather neatly into that formula as a very high priority, for the rather obvious reason that anyone with 1/3 of a brain in the United States can understand why we have a direct, immediate, and compelling interest in how the Central America Regional Initiative develops in the course of the next several years. It does not take a genius to realize that within, I'm guessing where we are right here, probably within about a mile to a mile and a half of where we are all seated, I believe if you were to make it worth my effort and offer me enough money, I could point out to you within 24 hours individuals who are associated with two rather large and well-known Central American-based or origin gangs. Is that of some mild interest to those who live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area? Perhaps. I would be able to point out to you probably, if you gave me enough time, 10 locations within 500 yards of where we are seated, where one could, if one wished, and you should not, acquire cocaine or other coca derivative products for which there is a 65% probability that that has touched Central America on its way up here. These are not esoteric issues. This is not an academic exercise. This is real world. And I frankly believe that not only do the American people and their elected representatives permit me to try to find ways to protect the Carson program, they kind of expect me to do that. As in, dumbbell, if you can't figure out how to protect this program, perhaps we might want to have another Assistant Secretary of State for Drugs and Law Enforcement. Will it be difficult? Yes, it will. What is mostly going to happen to me, I predict, Eric, is that unlike for the last 2 years, where we have been able, with considerable finesse and dexterity, to actually slip additional funding into Central America, beyond that which was originally appropriated and approved by Congress, I bet I'm going to find much of that drying up in the course of this year and next year. So the glory years, like there was 1 year where we were appropriated $80 million and we eventually managed to get 120. This is just my budget, the Inkle stuff, without breaking into the USAID accounts and the others. Or last year when we were appropriated $60 million and we found another 25 and we actually then squeezed another 10 for other purposes. That's going to be harder. But protecting, maintaining, and running the basic core program, I think not only should we be able to do it, but quite frankly, you should be able to suggest my replacement if I can't find a way to do it.
And on a related note, almost the second side of that same coin then, and assuming you are successful, but the program needs continue, as you described in your talk.
You know, she's hopeful I wouldn't be successful, since I said you could fire me if I was unsuccessful, but that's a different issue. Please continue, Dr. F.
What, if anything, are we asking the Central American governments to do in this regard? You had mentioned, and I think appropriately so in the context of some of the lessons learned and all that, this is a program developed in the region that we are supporting. It's a regional program. Presumably that means there are regional obligations as well. And so in the context of our own budget requirements and moving money and doing what you can to continue that, is there an ask for some of the Central American governments, or are they already doing all that could reasonably be expected and we'll move forward together and see what the results are?
Yeah, I mean, Eric, to begin with, let's state the obvious. Central America is not a monolithic institution and region. Each country is different, and they are at different levels of development, if you will, at the risk of appearing to be pandering. I would suggest that as you move further south into the Central American Isthmus, you obviously find far more competent, far more developed, and with institutions far stronger than you do further to the north. Now, this is a function, if you will, of the pressures developmental pressures, economic pressures, social and legal pressures that certain countries are under and others are not, but different models for different countries. Second, the Central American governments themselves have developed their own institution to coordinate among themselves. They call it SICA, and SICA, which did a superb job developing a plan and a strategy that the international community could then work off of in the year 2010, 2011. We've dropped off a bit in terms of SICA being the implementer, and to a certain extent that's probably as it should be. It's unfair to ask SICA, which is in essence an organization comprised of foreign ministries, to do security program implementation. So we've slipped. What we have is a regional plan that is largely being implemented on a bilateral basis, at least for right now. Third, my direct answer to your question, of course, is every country in Central America is playing an absolutely, well, it's not just a key role, it's playing the overwhelming majority of the role. I mean, I'm talking about us putting in somewhere in the vicinity of $120 to $125 million a year. I can assure you the collective 7 governments of Central America are putting in vastly more than that. It's about institution building. The institutions are theirs. We don't create the institutions, recruit the institutions, pay for the institutions. Those are Central American institutions. What we try to do is offer training, offer education, offer in some cases equipment and coordination capabilities to make them more effective. In the Merida Initiative, we used to throw out a figure, we still do, in fact, I shouldn't have said we used to. We throw out a figure which is for every $1 that the United States puts into Mexico under the Merida Initiative, the government of Mexico invests 13. My guess is that's a figure that's almost exactly the same in Central America. So when we say, are they participating as well? They aren't participating. They're driving this train. We're trying to add an additional car or two onto the long freight train, but that's their train.
No, that's important framework to have, so thank you for that and that clarification. We're going to go now to all of you. Let's take a round of 3. We're going to start here, 1, 2, and then I saw a question in the back. We've got a microphone, yes, to Stephen, please. Let's start with Stephen, yeah, and then we'll work our way up. Yep.
Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. Thank you, Ambassador. Despite your diplomatic training and your career in diplomatic service, and your
I still come from Texas, Dr.
Careful choice of words, I detect a slight enthusiasm about what you're doing these days. Is that enthusiasm shared on the Hill? And how about with the Central American countries and their leadership?
Good question. And the gentleman right in front, next row. Yep.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Paul Calix, Managing Editor of Southern Pulse. And before I begin, thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Brownfield, for this informative presentation. And my question is sort of a corollary to the one asked by the gentleman before me, that the criticisms that you mentioned in your speech, and you didn't explicitly say this, but I got a sense that they're the kind that you would receive here in Washington. So I did want to ask, what sort of, have you received any distinct feedback from Central American officials, thinking particularly from ones in Guatemala, for instance, and if there are any negative ones that come to mind, how would you respond to them? Thank you.
Thank you. And the third question, this gentleman, yeah, right, yeah. Here's the microphone here. There you go. Yep. Thank you.
David Holliday from the Latin America program of the Open Society Foundations. My question is about something more specific. What is there a particular institution or experience that you've had thus far in CARSI, or if taking into account that this is a long-term strategy, et cetera, where you feel like you've had the most success? And if so, what was it about that intervention or that strategy from CARSI that contributed to that? In the baseball analogy, who's your best slugger?
These are 3 good questions. I leave it to you to take them in whichever order you would like to address them.
Yeah. Before I forget it, I'm going to take the last one first. And I'm going to, even now I'm trying to, think of where I want to put these. I'll offer it right off the top of my head, the top three, and if I were to think longer, I could probably come up with another 30. But since you forced me to think on my feet, or at least on one foot while seated, I'm going to give you three. And I've carefully come up with an example from different countries who are dealing with different realities as they confront their respective Central America kind of crises, emergencies, or problem set. And not surprisingly, I picked two countries who are represented here with their diplomatic presence to make damn sure that they hear that I'm saying something exceptionally positive about them as I respond to your question. First, a government that may not be represented here is Guatemala. Now, give Guatemala its credit. I believe they have done, among other things, a very credible job through this UN-supported and Bill Brownfield or Inkel financed organization called CSIG to address corruption. And they've had considerable success. But you know, the thing I want to draw attention to in Guatemala is 7 years ago, Guatemala was I think, the preferred landing site for air tracks, which is to say small aircraft bringing illicit product, for the most part cocaine, north from South America, touching ground in Central America, and then transiting overland up through Mexico into the United States. Guatemala was their preferred landing point, the northeast sector of Guatemala. The Guatemalans, using CARSI funds and CARSI support, developed an aviation capability. And it's simple stuff, ladies and gents. I think it's 6 helicopters. And what they literally do is, when they catch wind of an aircraft that's coming down, they fill a couple of helicopters up with police officers, and they fly to the site. Now, for about a year, they were actually having a large number of takedowns. You know, they were landing on the airstrip and catching the rascals in the process, and were grabbing tons and tons of product. And you know, over the last 2 or 3 years, they have had almost no takedowns whatsoever. Is it because they have become stupid and incompetent? No, it's because their aviation capability has accomplished exactly what they wanted it to do. It convinced the traffickers not to fly their product to Guatemala. I'd call that a success story. You know, if you're saying success is defined by how many tons you seize, that's a complete failure. They've seized very little over the last 2 or 3 years. If you define success as they no longer fly product to Guatemala, then by God, that's about as successful as you could ask a program to be. Its neighbor, in fact, two of Guatemala's 3 neighbors, it's got 4 neighbors. Two of Guatemala's 2 southern neighbors, let's call it that, El Salvador and Honduras, both have substantial problems with gangs, criminal gangs, youth gangs. These are not drug trafficking organizations. These are MS-13 and Calle 18, by the way, gangs, which I point out, you will find a robust membership thereof within 2 miles of where we are seated right now. Both Honduras and El Salvador have put together very effective youth gang programs. And it loops together the youth themselves, and it tracks them into the school system, so the schools and school leadership is participating. Community leaders are participating. The national police, both of El Salvador and of Honduras, are participating, and they've been specially trained in terms of how to deal with kids age 9 to 15. And their families obviously are participating as well, since it's their kids that are happily or unhappily being put into these 6-week programs. It's a good program. It's actually delivering good results because, among other things, it's telling kids that are at that impressionable stage, one, what are the dangers of the gang community, and 2, what their alternatives are. It's a cool program. I like it. It's called the GREAT program. It stands for something. I can't recall what it stands for. Gang Resistance Education and Training. You see? Great. And it is, in fact, a great program. Get it, Eric?
I got it.
Little play on words.
Even I got that.
Finally, I am not unaware that I also am, we are blessed and honored by the presence of the senior-most diplomatic representative of the Republic of Costa Rica, where I was just earlier this week. May I tell you, Costa Rica, which has a very different package of problems. I don't want to state too much, but there are very few countries in Central America who would not happily trade all of their problems for Costa Rica's problems right now in a straight trade with no protest whatsoever. Costa Rica clearly does not have the same degree of security problems and threats as does much of the northern tier of Central American countries. That said, if you are a common citizen of Costa Rica, that does you gives you small satisfaction if you have become the victim of street crime, if you have found some member of your family has been victimized by crime, if you're seeing growing statistics, small though they may be relative to other countries, but nevertheless growing statistics of illicit product being trafficked through your country. Costa Rica has a couple of really cool NGOs. I visited one of them just Tuesday of this week. I hope I'm not going to offend you. It's called Pan y Amor. And I've got to tell you, Costa Rica is a country that has figured better perhaps than any other Central American country that I can identify how to use civil society, partnered with the government and government institutions, using the international community for donor support to actually address issues that are very close to the heart of the community. Now, the particular program that I helped, I guess, launch or announce this Tuesday of this week was a gender violence program. And in essence, it was setting up evidence collection centers in 3 different sites around the country that would allow victims to actually have access to counseling and to professionals who would collect the evidence that would allow them eventually to get justice if that was the direction in which the case would go. But this is just an example of what I would regard as a very skillful and very successful use of civil society to advance both government and community interests. Those are 3 examples that I would offer you of I won't call them our greatest sluggers, but each one was a good, clean, at least 2-bagger, and who knows, one of them might have already gone all the way to a triple, probably with a slide, not a stand-up triple, but you don't get a stand-up all that often anyway. The first set of questions. I mean, as you can well imagine, gents, I was offering 5 criticisms that I didn't just make up. I've heard them a good bit in the course of the last year or so, and I must say I've heard them more recently than in the past. I do not resent criticism. Actually, I kind of welcome it. Often critics have useful things to say. I don't have to agree with everything they say to nevertheless acknowledge that there must be a reason why I'm hearing some of these points of criticism, and to figure how we can adjust our program, our approach, our strategy to address at least some parts of the criticism. There are skeptics on the Hill, although I've got to tell you, there is fairly broad, widespread support for CARSI as a concept in the United States Congress. There are concerns with specific parts of CARSI in specific countries over specific incidents during specific periods of time. I hope that's enough specificity for you, Dr. Donahue. And some of them are fairly important people, like the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, feels very strongly about human rights issues and will, in fact, place holds on vast sums of money, not permitting it to be spent until he finds that a response has been given to certain specific human rights concerns. I don't challenge that. I don't question it. The Leahy Amendment has been with us now for 30 years or so, I believe, and it's a good thing. It is a good thing for the world. Would we have gotten there without the Leahy Amendment? Probably, but we certainly got there faster, more directly, and more bluntly because the distinguished senior senator from Vermont said, you will not give any money to any individual nor organization that is run by an individual who is known to have or reasonably believed to have committed or participated in substantial abuses of human rights. And while it is excruciatingly difficult on a case-by-case basis to apply that amendment correctly to everyone's satisfaction, just the process of going through is helpful. My own guess, gentlemen, is that we are going to continue to hear criticism on elements of CARSI by both helpful critics and unhelpful critics. I believe to a certain extent the fact that part of CARSI is the drug element, and drug policy is very clearly under review today, both in our own nation, and those of you who are not certain what I'm talking about, I would invite you to perhaps visit Colorado or Washington to get a clearer sense, but also in the hemispheric sense. The OAS General Assembly to be held in June of this year. The host government, Guatemala, has announced the theme will be reviewing hemispheric drug policy. And in the global sense, I just had the pleasure of spending 3 days, 2 weeks ago, in Vienna at the UN Annual Drug Conference, known as the CND. And I can tell you, the policy reviewers are full of oats, and they are pushing hard for an overall review of the 3 international drug conventions. So we've got a robust, healthy debate. Some of it's good, some of it's stupid. But at the end of the day, you got to have the stupid in order to make the smart people kind of think through their arguments. There will undoubtedly be some changes and adjustments, and that has an impact to a certain extent on CARSI, because those who are saying we should change our total drug policy then say, why are we focusing so much, although it's only 30%, so much of CARSI on drug-related issues. Still in all, you got it right, Steve. I am optimistic about this, and I'm kind of enthusiastic, because I'm so damned old now that I actually, you can't batter me into defensiveness by saying, why haven't you succeeded yet? Why haven't you succeeded yet? Because I've been at this so blipping long. I remember the first Central American initiative. I went to El Salvador in 1981, even before you did, you rascal. And I am fully aware of just how bad things can be, and then how much better they can become, but it takes time. So those of you who wish to bludgeon me into negativeness and pessimism, you will not succeed. Back to you, Dr. Forrester.
Well, do you have time for another round, or
sure.
Okay, well, let's take one more.
I'm good for one more.
All right.
Hell, I might even be good for 2. Depends on how tough they are.
Well, we'll start with Whitney Debevoise and see. He's a tough customer, so right here. Let's get the microphone. Let's take Whitney and then Ambassador Maisto, and then we'll finish with David, and if we can make sure the questions are relatively short, please.
Whitney Debevoise, Martel and Porter. Picking up where you just left off, this is not the first round on this. What did we learn from all of the assistance we provided for judicial training, prosecutors training, and so forth the last time around, and what are we being able to apply this time around?
Thanks. And if you could just hand it to John right next to you. There you go.
Thank you. John Maisto, U.S. Education Finance Group Director. Assistant Secretary, there was scant mention of Mexico. Could you say something about the attitude of the new government of Mexico with regard to Central America, which is really very close by, and how our relations with
Right
Mexico,
next door in the far,
yeah,
in the far
that's
south, have you noticed?
I recall.
You can step from Mexico
Yeah.
into Central America
Yeah,
in
I
a
recall
couple of places.
if you're looking at a map a few weeks ago. Could you, in particular, say something about General Oscar Naranjo, who did such a good job in Colombia, is now working in Mexico. I had a chance to meet him last week and found him a very impressive gentleman.
Interesting. Thanks, John. And then David Lewis right in front of you, please. Yeah. Just work the microphone up, yeah.
Thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade. I actually lived in Central America and raised a family there during that period. It used to take about 12 to 18 hours to cross border by land, and that was for me because I was an international civil servant. So things
That was expedited treatment.
Right. So I got privileged treatment. It now takes an hour almost at any border unless you bring in a truckload of something. So that's true. I'm wondering if you can just share some insights. I guess if we're in the fifth inning with Carson, SICA, with their Central America strategy is probably like second, third inning, but it's got the hump of the entire international community, not just the U.S. So could you just share some insights on how we're viewing that from the U.S. perspective and what are the prospects, because that's obviously a deeper bench than just U.S. resources in this environment. Thank you.
Yeah, and even though I didn't say I was going to do this, because you brought her into the conversation and she's asked for a very quick opportunity, the ambassador of Costa Rica right here in the front row, please.
I was very elliptical in my reference, Eric. You broke the code.
Right here, please.
Thank you.
Here's the microphone.
Ambassador, thank you
Go
so
ahead.
much
Go
for your remarks. Am I supposed to talk? Yes.
Yes, there we go. We just
But
need
you
a
have to, now you
microphone.
can
There we
sing.
go. All right.
You have a microphone. Now you can sing to us.
Right. You'll all leave if I say. Thank you very much for your remarks, Ambassador. I share your deep-seated optimism about Central America. I think we have Colombia to look at as an example that you can get through the tunnel and come out in the light, where Ambassador Frechette served and you did too. And I think that through this whole process we've learned a huge amount. We've learned conceptually and we've learned operationally very, very important lessons, and we've had perversely many positive results from the need to combat violence and drug addiction and drug trafficking, because we are being forced to work together as a region more than we've ever had to before or in a long time, and because we've realized that we share the responsibility. The market, the demand and the supply are no longer politically differentiable in terms of responsibility, and that's a huge leap as well. I only want to tell you that I'm very concerned that our very simple map that we had before, where the drugs were produced down here, they passed through the middle, and they were consumed up here, has now been very, very desdibujado. And now the producers are consumers, and the consumers are producers, and the consumers are traffic bridges to other places, etc. So that's one thing that worries me. Is there anyone, you already mentioned that people are thinking and discussing the worldwide global problem of illicit traffic, I guess it would be. And so that, I think, is going to make life a lot more complicated for all of us, even if we each solve our individual, in our back patio problem. And I would like you to talk just a little bit more about that, if you will, sir.
Sure.
Thank you.
Con gusto. This time let me work through them in the order in which they came to me, because I actually wrote it down so I may remember in the order in which it came. Kind of comparing judicial and other institutional reform in the Carson context with the last time we attempted to do this, which in essence was the 1980s, where some of you who are at least over the age of 40 will recall there was a tremendous amount of focus and attention by the United States of America on the region. May I tell you, I think Carsey is an infinitely more sophisticated, intelligent, and therefore likely to succeed initiative than the Central America initiative of the 1980s. And the reason is fairly simple. The approach in the 1980s was much more a captive of something that the younger members of this group don't even know what I'm talking about except in the history books. It was, in essence, the last struggle in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. So everything that was done was focused very much on that. It had very much a counterinsurgency feel to it. And the development, the reforms, the institution building were processed through that filter. Now, at the end of the day, I do not apologize for the results. Remember, I repeat, as were some of you, I believe I was in Central America, and certainly in El Salvador, in one of its darkest days. I arrived in San Salvador in March of 1981. It was at that time, we didn't know it at the time, but it was near the end of the so-called Ofensiva Final of the FMLN, the final offensive. We didn't know it at the time because they didn't announce that they were backing off. The first 6 months I was at the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador, we were required to carry a day bag with us in which we had a change of clothes and a basic toothbrush and a razor. Why? Because we did not know if we were going to be evacuated off the embassy's roof in the course of the day. Now that's getting pretty close to saying we can't even tell you if this government is going to survive 8 hours because we had curfew, so we all had to be home by 6 p.m. That is how dark those days had become. We are eons better than that now. And that's one of the reasons why Carsey, in my opinion, is a far more sophisticated and likely to be successful initiative because it's starting from a much stronger base to begin with. Yes, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador are under a tremendous amount of pressure, but these are not threatening the state itself in a way that several states back in the early 1980s were very definitely under threat. And bad as the killings are, and they are horrible when you have a homicide rate of more than 80 per 100,000. Nevertheless, they're not the equivalent of what Junior Officer Brownfield had to do back in 1981, where once a week I went out to a place called El Playón, which was outside of San Salvador, and my job was to count the additional numbers of bodies that I could find that had been dumped there since I was there the week before. And ladies and gentlemen, that the number was usually approaching like 100 every blipping week. So tell me that things are pretty bad in Central America today. I agree. That's why we are doing Carsey. You will never convince this old fart that it's anywhere near as bad as we were dealing with for those of you who have memories that go back that far in the early 1980s. Dr. Maisto, who refuses to treat this as a Central America discussion and is insisting upon calling it a Mesoamerican discussion. Nevertheless, fair enough questions. Enrique Peña Nieto, who by the way, he's at December, January, February. He's about 3 2/3 months of a new administration. And I believe is still working through what his final kind of security policy will be. The clear message that his government has received from my government is, we will work with you in whatever direction, whatever organization, whatever way you wish. You will be the decision maker in terms of how the United States and Mexico will work together on security issues. His government has said to us several times that they are very much interested in looking to their, as they call it, to their southern border, which obviously is their border with Guatemala, Belize, and in a sense their border with Central America. I think this is a good thing. At the end of the day, it will be the Mexican government's decision, as well as the Central American government's decision. In the case of Mexico, how much spare capacity does it have to export to Central America in terms of training, assistance, or support. In the case of Central American governments, it is how much do they wish to deal directly with Mexico as opposed to other donors. From my perspective, it would be value added. If nothing else, the problem sets are obviously linked between Mexico and Central America, and the extent to which we're dealing with them in a cooperative manner, I think, is a good thing. I think very highly of Oscar Naranjo. Highly is a good word, since, as you know, he's 9 feet 10 inches tall, and mortified me probably 50 times in the course of my 3 years in Colombia by forcing me to come after him to the podium, where I would usually find the microphone towering about 3 feet above my head, forcing me either to have to stand and talk to the ceiling or to leap up like a basketball player and haul the thing down. Having said that, may I make the following statement, John? I believe Oscar Naranjo is probably the finest police officer in the entire Western Hemisphere. And I would include, I'll probably, if you quote me on this, I know I'll get hammered for it, but I would include all police officers in my home country as well. That is how highly I think of Naranjo when I think of the situation that he inherited. When I think that he, in essence, came to senior positions in the 1990s, when the Colombian National Police was losing officers to the tune at times like more than 100 a week, as the Medellin and Cali cartels were clearly systematically assassinating police officers, and how he kept his eye on that ball, how he reformed his national police, and how he turned the Colombian National Police from one of the most disliked and despised institutions in Colombia to, by the end of his tenure, to the most respected institution in all of Colombia. That, to my way of thinking, is what every police officer in the world should study and should ask himself the question, how the hell did Oscar Naranjo do that? And his views on Mexico, I think, are very worth listening to, and not surprisingly, I think the government of Enrique Peña Nieto is, in fact, listening to him. SICA, in its coordinating role, you are correct, of course. At the end of the day, the value that SICA brings is the ability to provide a central coordinating mechanism for the entire international community that is willing to cooperate with and participate in the Central America Initiative. A number of Europeans, the Canadians, to some extent Mexico and Colombia, some of the major international organizations in the UN system, the IDB. The value of SICA is that it gives a basic coherent plan where everyone can kind of take a piece of it and say, we will do this. By having a single plan, you're able to minimize overlap and ensure maximum coverage of all the issues that the governments themselves have defined as their priorities. The problem that we have right now is they have not yet completed the transition from a planner and strategy maker to an implementer and executor. And that's where we need to focus time and attention, because donor governments can wait only so long, and I am guilty of this, ladies and gentlemen, where I have said, right, if no one else is going to tell me how to implement this program, if no one else is going to say, give us the funds and we will implement it, then I will do it myself directly with the individual government. I can always walk back. I can always pause in my direct bilateral and start doing something through SICA, but SICA has to then be in a position to say, we will take the $25 million, we will put it onto these programs, we will be fully accountable therefore, and at the end of the day, we will produce these results, which will be visible to the naked eye. When we get to that point, SICA, I will say, is 100% effective. Right now, they're at about the 75% mark. They're still in transition from planner to implementer. And finally, distinguidísima embajadora, may I suggest you have put your finger on something that, in a sense, the entire world needs to be a little bit focused on. And that is, even as we move down this exciting new road of reviewing, revising, and altering global drug policy, let us remember that the basic rules, systems, processes, and activities that have been part of this for the last 40 years are changing, and they are changing dramatically. And it would be very unfortunate and perhaps even foolish to make revisions or adjustments based upon 1972 data, when in fact in 2013 things are very, very different. And let me throw out a few differences. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, probably even 10 years ago, most of the trafficking in the Western Hemisphere was south-north. Product was grown and cultivated in a few countries in South America along the banks, along the slopes of the Andes, was then turned into refined product and flown, driven, or shipped north into North America. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the majority of the product moves on an east-west axis, not a north-south axis. We had better focus on that. Oh, the United States is still, by a little bit, not much, still the largest cocaine-consuming nation in the world. The second largest cocaine-consuming nation in the world is located in South America. They have got an enormous crack cocaine crisis on their hands in Brazil. We have some experience with that. We had a phenomenal crack cocaine problem in the United States in the 1980s, and in fact, law enforcement between the U.S. and Brazil is doing a great deal of cooperation on how to deal with this. But the point is, we're dealing with a different set of realities. One thing that traffickers have learned over the last 40 years is that in 1973, when you were moving your product up and you had to buy the customs agents and the border guards along the way in order to allow you to move the product, you paid them in cash. 10,000 bucks per movement, give them a little shoebox filled with money, your product moves through, everything's fine. That is not how they do business anymore. Now they pay in kind. They pay in product. Now, why do we care about that? Why does the ambassador to Costa Rica care about that? Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to pay an official with a kilo of cocaine in order to allow you to move 100 kilos through, that official has a brick in his hand. As a brick, it has no value. I suppose he could use it as building material, but it wouldn't be a particularly economical sort of building material. What he needs to do with that brick is convert it into cash. That means he must sell it on the local market. To sell it on the local market, there must be a demand for it. For there to be a demand for it, he's got to make the locals want to consume cocaine. Good business for the narcotics trafficker because they're building an additional market, and at the end of the day, they get to use their network to build the market for them. That is why transit countries today have every right in the world to be exceptionally concerned about how this whole drama is unfolding. Is it a good idea for us to review global drug policy, strategy, and even conventions? Yes, of course it is. There's nothing engraved in stone in 1963, I think, when the first UN drug convention was ratified. Of course it should be reviewed, but we should review it based upon real-world conditions in 2013. We should review it in terms of what we are trying to accomplish, which presumably is reduce the abuse of illicit, harmful, toxic, and addictive drugs in whatever way makes the most sense. And I am open to all sorts of ideas as to how to do it, but please don't parrot to me the same arguments from 1973 and think that somehow or other this is going to solve the problem. You allowed me to get on my high horse, Eric. You should not have. I shall now stop. Back over to you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and we are at time, but I have to say this is exactly as promised, and there was an element of entertainment as well, so thank you for, even in your current state, coming and really giving us a tour de force.
You're just worried that I'm going to die right here. And if I die right here, it's Council of America's fault. It's not theirs. It's not his fault. It's yours.
We had a taster taste the water already. So, but I hope you will come back. I hope it won't take you the period of time that you alluded to in your speech of years, but I hope when you're ready to come back and give us another update and hopefully a success story at that point, we'll be ready to receive that. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, one final item of business, and that's to please join me in thanking our guest for his terrific